All right, let's get cooking. Welcome to the latest edition of Chin Check Sports Radio. I'm your host, JD. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to join us. And as always, we welcome any suggestions, feedback, comments, and criticisms, which improves the quality of our program, which ultimately improves your listening experience. On this particular broadcast, we're going to have a lot of fun this evening. This all stems from a question that was posed on Twitter, and the gentleman asked, would we be willing to pay $500 for the following fight card? Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury, Errol Spence versus Terrence Crawford, Gervonta Davis versus Teofimo Lopez, Ryan Garcia versus Devin Haney, Artur Beterbiev versus Dimitri Bivol. And my response to the question was, no, I would not. And not because I don't necessarily think the fights are not worth the price. Those are quality fights, and those are fights that should be made in boxing. The issue is, where is the star power in that group of fighters to warrant that asking price? Because us, as a hardcore fight fans, we'll pretty much follow a good fight. We will YouTube it, we will stream it, we will go to the fight live, we will order a fight on pay-per-view. I've spent a lot of good money on pay-per-view matches. But to command that type of asking price, your stars or your fighters have to be stars that transcend the sport. That's the key with boxing. Us hardcore fans, we're going to follow. But you want to get the casual fans, the people who really don't watch boxing, but they hear about it from us hardcore fight fans, much like the Super Bowl. You have a lot of people who don't watch football during the NFL season. As you see, we do our weekly Dallas Cowboys review. We also watch other NFL games. So, of course, by the time the Super Bowl rolls around, we know everything that has led up to it, how the teams got to the game, what path that they took. Now, same thing in boxing to a certain extent. When it comes to big fights, big fight cards, huge matches, you have people who really don't watch boxing. If you actually look at certain fighters, well, certain fights per se, and you're going to have a lot of celebrities sitting in front row. Now, they're only there because, again, it's the atmosphere, it's the environment. People love being around a big fight. So to get that type of asking price, which one out of that group of fighters is going to be your star? And really, Tyson Fury, could he be a mainstream star or a star outside of the sport of boxing? I can make an argument because Tyson Fury is very charismatic. He talks a mile a minute. He has a gift of gab as well as being highly skilled. He has a magnetic personality, so he can be a star. Maybe Gervonta Davis. We're talking about outside of boxing. Now, what helps his popularity, and again, I'm saying maybe, what helps his popularity is his association with one Floyd Mayweather. And he's not a big pay-per-view star yet. He had a very exciting fight in his last fight, but he's not that big of a star yet to warrant that asking price. Ryan Garcia, he's a big star on social media, and of course a lot of casual fans are on social media, so that might help his star. But other than that, that's only three guys maybe that you can say is a big star outside of boxing. Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence, they are great fighters, top of the line fighters, but are they truly transcendent stars outside the sport? Errol Spence Jr. was supposed to get his chance of getting more mainstream recognition with his fight with Manny Pacquiao, but unfortunately, due to an injury, he could not make that fight. So, again, out of that card, I can only point to maybe three definite one guy who is a true star outside of boxing. So now that got us thinking, what would be our all-time fight card would we shell out X amount of money for? And this is, I'm calling all my boys to the West, Julio, Ralph Adam, McKnight, Felix, I know you're listening. I'm gonna need some responses. And it's gonna be fun, and then we definitely had a lot of fun putting this together, a lot of nostalgia. Now, what was our criteria for picking these fights. Number one, they had to be fights that we grew up watching. Now, it's easy to say I would pay for a fight card with Ali, Frazier 1, Frazier Foreman, Foreman Ali. You know, again, I wasn't born. So, again, of course, everything I read about those fights, they were a big deal. But I was not, obviously, I wasn't born then to really understand the magnitude of what led up to that fight, what, you know, how the fighters got there, how the fight was signed, what are the circumstances. You know, this is just from what I read in books, watching documentaries, and things like that. And I tell people, when there is a big fight, now this is just for me personally. I'm sure some of you might feel the same way, but it's just for me personally. When there's a big fight, usually fights are on Saturdays, there is something that I mentally prepare myself to get into a big fight. Whether it's going to a sports bar, actually going to the fight, or watching the fight on pay-per-view. Get up, clean the house, top to bottom, make sure everything is taken care of. I order my food, you know, as the fight is starting and as you build to the main event, you know, you start to get nervous for the fighters and your palm gets sweaty like you're actually in the ring itself. When I used to go to the sports bar, I would go early. I'm talking about right at like 8:30, 8:45. Around 9 o'clock, your undercard starts. I would order my food, pay for my food, tip the waitress. So by the time when the main event got started, and of course now everybody's piling into the sports bar, and now it's packed shoulder to shoulder, I didn't have time to worry about, well, where's the waitress? Let me pay my tab and let me pay my bill. I don't have time for that. I like to get there early, eat my food, pay for my food, and I don't have anything else to worry about when now I can enjoy the fight as the main event starts. Going to a fight live, I like to be in my seat early, because I know people really don't come in until closer to the main event. But I want to sit in my seat. I don't want to be playing around and hilling and dallying for parking. Let me get there early. Let me park my car. Let me go inside. I actually watched undercard fights. So that's just me. When there's a big fight, is my whole day is really centered around that fight. So I personally love it. Maybe some of you might feel the same way. This is just us at Chin Check Radio speaking on this. So that was our first criteria, was fights that we grew up watching, that we were around. We know the emotions that went into that fight. So that was our first criteria. Our second rule was we could only pick one fighter once. So we could pick a fighter one time. It would have been easy to pick, let's say, a Floyd Mayweather versus De La Hoya, a Floyd Mayweather versus Canelo, a Floyd Mayweather no. These lists, you have to make hard choices. You have to make hard decisions. And so we discipline ourselves to choose a fighter only one time. So again, this is stuff that we really had to think deep to how we're gonna put this ultimate fight card together. So that was another criteria. Another thing that is something that, again, my third criteria was a fight that was truly anticipated by fight fans as well as the casual fans. Because again, for instance, I would say oftentimes, you have certain fights that we are looking forward to that might have come on HBO or Showtime, but that was really only for us as fight fans. Case in point, the late Arturo Gatti versus Mickey Ward. That's a fight that we knew as hardcore fight fans that had a potential to be something big, and the fight actually ended up being bigger. Jose Luis Castillo versus the late Diego Corrales. We as hardcore fight fans knew what that fight was going to be about, and it becoming probably the best fight of all time. But again, there's nothing that the mainstream media was talking about, something that the casual sports fan was talking about. And what I mean by mainstream sports media is, again, your ESPNs, your Fox News, your Fox Sports. Is it covered on these shows? And you only notice when it's these big, huge fights is when it's covered by ESPN or it's covered by Fox Sports. So your other fighters that we've had, James Toney versus Vasily Jirov, was a fight that we were looking forward to as hardcore fight fans. I could think of Zab Judah versus Floyd Mayweather. I could think of Zab Judah versus Castillo. So these are fights that people were looking forward to, but again, only hardcore fight fans. So these fights that we put together were fights that have superstars in them, and because of that, the mainstream media and the casual sports fan was also looking towards this fight. So those are some of the criteria that we put into really making this list, and we have some quality fights for you, and we hope that you're going to enjoy it. And again, this is going to be the only time here on YouTube when we do our broadcast that we're going to respectfully ask / playfully command a response. Please leave your comments in the comment section. You can respond back on Twitter. I definitely would like a response for everybody to see, and again, the questions that I'm going to pose later. So, first up on our dream card matchup, I have John the Quiet Man Ruiz versus Roy Jones Jr. That fight took place March 1st, 2003. Roy Jones, the undisputed light heavyweight champion of the world, moving up to the heavyweight division to take on WBA heavyweight champion John Ruiz. Now, why was that fight so significant? Roy Jones Jr. while entering that fight was 47-1. His only loss at that time was a disqualification loss to Montel Griffin, where he knocked Griffin while he was on the ground, which resulted in a disqualification. Versus John Ruiz, who won a portion of the heavyweight champion of the world, fought a couple of rough and tumble fights with Evander Holyfield, had recently defeated Kurt Johnson in a laughable title defense. Now, why was that fight so big? Again, Roy Jones being the undisputed light heavyweight champion of the world. And some of these fights that we're going to talk about are fights that we've already discussed when we've done our all-time top 10 fighters that we grew up watching. So Roy Jones going to this fight with all of his worldly gifts, his otherworldly speed, reflexes, combination punching, fast punching, everything, was a serious step up in competition in class because he had dominated the 160-pound division, the 168-pound division, the super middleweight division, as well as the light heavyweight division. So there were questions of, at that time, was Roy Jones Jr., especially in that late 90s going to early 2000s, was Roy Jones Jr. the best fighter of all time? I mean, people forget how great this guy truly was, the gifts that he had. And what was so significant to this fight was him moving up from light heavyweight, jumping over the cruiserweight division to step into the heavyweight division. Now, the light heavyweight division is 175 pounds. Your heavyweights at that time were over 200, 210, 215. John Ruiz easily walking to the ring weighing 225. So even putting on solid muscle, Jones still would have been a clearly smaller fighter. But the old adage was, does a great small guy beat a pretty solid big guy? Now, let me rephrase that. The old saying is, can a good big man will always beat a good little man. In the case of Roy Jones, at that time, an exceptional, out of this world little man against an average or good big man. So there was a lot of emotions going to that fight. That fight was definitely looked at because, again, and there was history involved. Roy Jones Jr. going into that fight was aiming to be the first fighter who held a title at 160 pounds in 106 years to win a version of the heavyweight championship of the world, and really the second light heavyweight after Michael Spinks, who did it in 1985, who moved up and beat Larry Holmes for the heavyweight championship of the world. So a lot of history into that fight, and that was a fight a lot of people were looking into. Now, was Roy Jones a big star? Roy Jones was a big star, obviously within a sport of boxing. He slowly started to become more of a mainstream star because, again, he was just untouchable in the ring. LL Cool J, the famous song 4-3-2-1. Going against me is like challenging Roy to a fight. Roy Jones Jr. was on the Wayans Brothers show. I believe Method Man and Redman, they serenaded him to the ring and he came out rapping, and Roy Jones was a rap artist. So Roy Jones, he did things to really go outside of boxing. The same Roy Jones who played a basketball game and defended his title on the same night. So really, he had already did everything that he can do in the light heavyweight division, and people were really pushing, especially inside of boxing, for Roy Jones to take challenges, to really step up and to really take challenges. And that was a fight that a lot of us was really looking forward towards that fight. I remember leaving work early for that and setting up, and me and all the fellas watched that fight. So that's going to be the first fight on our card on our Chin Check Radio, our super card, Roy Jones Jr. challenging for the heavyweight championship of the world against John Ruiz, and I believe you all know that Roy Jones won that fight hands down. Next up, the late Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker versus Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. from September 10th, 1993. Going into that fight, Sweet Pea was 32-1 with a questionable loss, 15 knockouts. Sweet Pea was a WBC and the lineal welterweight champion of the world. Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., 87-0, 75 knockouts. He was a WBC and the lineal light welterweight champion at 140 pounds. Chavez was the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, and Sweet Pea was the number 2 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Now, yes, I remember watching this fight because we talked about Chavez versus Meldrick Taylor. Again, that's one of the worst decisions I ever saw, bad stoppage. Watching Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker coming up. So this is really my years of really understanding boxing, and I love Sweet Pea. I love defense. Myself being a southpaw, that's why I had a real liking to Sweet Pea, because he fought the way I fought, and it actually looked pretty cool. So a lot was going into that fight. You have the brilliance of a Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker against the ever coming at you, charging forward, that just thudding Chavez Jr. Also, too, with his undefeated record. And, of course, Chavez, ladies and gentlemen, and I believe I mentioned this when I did Chavez on our top 10 fighters of all time. Chavez clearly is the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. No questions asked. A big star out of Culiacan, Mexico. So you already know, in the arena, you would have had a lot of Mexican fans in that arena supporting one Chavez Jr. And if I'm mistaken, that fight was in San Antonio, Texas. I believe at the Alamo Dome. So that goes to show you the star power of Chavez, especially at his prime, commanding that type of audience in that arena. So that was a fight people were definitely looking forward to. And again, that's our number 2 fight on our all-time Chin Check Radio fight card. Next up, Gennady Golovkin versus Canelo Alvarez 1 from September 16th, 2017 at the T-Mobile Arena. Triple G, 37-0 with 33 knockouts against one Canelo Alvarez, who was 49-1 with 1 draw, and that 1 loss came to Floyd Mayweather. 34 KOs for the middleweight championship of the world. Now, folks, this too was a highly anticipated matchup because you have Gennady Golovkin, who was knocking everybody out who they put in front of him. This guy seemed unbeatable. That straight, standard Eastern European fighter, good solid jab, good right hand, just a solid fighter versus Canelo Alvarez, who in the post-Mayweather era is now seen as the biggest star in boxing, and I can make an argument, I think Canelo is still the biggest star in boxing. And so this fight was highly anticipated because this was Canelo moving up. Remember, Canelo started off as a 154-pounder. Usually guys who fight at 154 pounds or the junior middleweight division, they eventually become middleweights. So you have Golovkin, who defended his title X amount of times, who had a high knockout percentage rate, was now going against Canelo Alvarez. So we're talking about 2 guys who are evenly matched. Now, in terms of boxing skills, Golovkin had boxing skills, but he had the power. Canelo was the better, quote, boxer. And there was a lot of people felt that Canelo was ducking Triple G. And I remember after, I believe, Canelo beat Amir Khan is when he made the statement that Golovkin was next. So that was a fight that everybody was anticipating. And Canelo, again, being the biggest star in boxing, I think he would have commanded a lot of that crowd. Again, this is right after the Julio Cesar Chavez crowd. So, and again, another big star in Mexico. You can say if Chavez is the most popular fighter ever out of Mexico, you got to think to yourself, you have Chavez, you have Canelo, Marco Antonio Barrera, Eric Morales, and Juan Manuel Marquez. I would say right now that Canelo, behind Chavez, would have to be the most popular Mexican fighter of all time. So again, in that fight alone, that generated 1.3 million pay-per-view buys a gate of $27 million from 17,000 tickets sold. And actually the third highest gate in boxing history. So that fight was highly anticipated. I know I was looking for that. I was looking towards that fight. And to this day, that's a fight that people still discuss whether they feel that he won the fight or not. So it's to have that third fight on this card. Again, folks, we got a lot more for you, so please stand by. Next up, Oscar De La Hoya versus Felix Tito Trinidad. For the welterweight champion of the world, you have Oscar De La Hoya, the golden boy, who was 31-0 with 25 knockouts, versus Tito, 35-0, 30 knockouts. That fight took place September 18th, 1999 at the Mandalay Bay. Now, we have discussed this fight when we talked about De La Hoya as well as Tito on our Chin Check Radio all-time favorite fighters that we grew up watching. There's no point discussing what happened in that fight. You have your own belief. That fight set the non-heavyweight fight record with 1.4 million buys. Now, why was that fight so anticipated? Because you have De La Hoya, the golden boy, the 1992 gold medalist, the superstar. I mean, you figure De La Hoya now, we're talking about star power. So here we go. We talked about Roy Jones was starting to become a star outside of boxing. Chavez was a star really in Mexico. Oscar De La Hoya, and even Roy Jones, as popular as he was not as popular as when Oscar De La Hoya. So we're talking about somebody who moved the needle, somebody who all others were measured, especially they fought together how they fought together concurrently. So De La Hoya clearly was a star outside of boxing. He attracted a lot of the Latino community. He attracted a lot of women. He brought a lot of women into boxing. So this guy clearly was a star. And with that gold medal pedigree, with the smile, the matinee idol looks, so this guy was a star. Then you have Felix Trinidad, who was the knockout artist out of Puerto Rico, probably the most famous fighter out of Puerto Rico. So any one of my guys, y'all please check me on that if I need to be checked. So again, now you have the dynamic also of the Mexico and Puerto Rico rivalry. Again, coming from the Northeast, growing up around a lot of Puerto Ricans. Yes, there is this rivalry in boxing with Puerto Rico and Mexico to see which Hispanic, country or territory has the best fighters. This is something that's been going on for decades. So you also have that as well. Now with Tito, his large following came from the East Coast, obviously from New York City, from New Jersey. And we're talking where that whole eastern seaboard, that's where a lot of you Puerto Ricans are, versus De La Hoya, who came from California. A lot of you Mexicans are on the West Coast. So that alone was a highly anticipated fight. And by the way, these are undefeated welterweights who was going back, let's say, 18 years before to Sugar Ray Leonard and Thomas A. Hearns. Two guys who are welterweights, and the welterweight division is one of the glamour divisions in boxing, along with the heavyweight and the middleweight division. That moves the needle when you have two quality heavyweights, two quality middleweights, and I you know what? I rephrase that. I would say heavyweight, followed by welterweight, followed by middleweight. And your welterweights have always kind of been the face of boxing. And there was a changing of the guard because you had your black fighters in Thomas Hearns and Sugar Ray Leonard to your Latin fighters and your Hispanic fighters in De La Hoya and one Trinidad. And Trinidad had a rabid fan base. De La Hoya had a rabid fan base along with casual fans, along with women. And this is the fight that people were definitely looking towards that fight. Who would have been the best welterweight of that era? And that also, too, was a little bit of a golden era among welterweights. But that, at that time, was the biggest fight that could be made in the welterweight division. And that's a fight that people were definitely highly anticipating. Next up, Lennox Lewis versus Mike Tyson. June 8th, 2002, from the Pyramid in Memphis, Tennessee. That fight was originally supposed to be April 6th of 2002, but if you all remember, there was going to be a press conference. There was a big old brawl at the press conference. The city of Las Vegas decided not to grant Mike Tyson a boxing license, for at that time, Mike Tyson was literally seen as a crazy man and an emotional wreck. So Las Vegas decided not to grant him a boxing license. than all other state athletic commissions respected, and they honored the rule of the Nevada State Athletic Commission of not granting Iron Mike a license to fight, especially in New York City where Mike is from. And the state of Tennessee granted Mike a boxing license because they saw the economic impact of that fight. So going into that fight, the great Lennox Lewis, who we have mentioned is one of the all-time underrated heavyweight champions that we've ever had. Lewis, 39-2-1, 30 knockouts. Mike Tyson, 49-3, 43 KOs. Now, why was that fight so significant? Mike Tyson was still really living off of his reputation forged in the 1980s. Kid Dynamite, the knockout kid, winning the youngest heavyweight champion of all time at 20 years old. There was still this aura and this mystique about Mike Tyson. Knockout losses to Buster Douglas, be damned. Rape convictions and spending time in prison, be damned. So 3 years outside of the ring, really in his prime. Coming back and fighting 4 insignificant fights, losing to Evander Holyfield, including getting himself purposely disqualified. Really fighting nothing fight for the last, from 97, which is the Holyfield rematch, the earbite incident, till 2002 was 5 years of Mike Tyson pretty much fighting nobody. And it was interesting. Now, Lewis by this time has now established himself as the best heavyweight of his era. Now, this is despite setbacks versus Oliver McCall, despite setbacks versus Hasim Rahman. This was the biggest fight, and I think a part of the reason why this fight was made, or why there was a lot of anticipation going into this fight, because a lot of people really didn't like Lennox Lewis. They loved Mike Tyson, and they were hoping for some shot that Tyson was going to knock Lennox Lewis out, bring the heavyweight champion of the world back. Mike was going to somehow reclaim his life and reclaim his glory, and Lewis was going to be seen as not, well, it was going to confirm the belief that Lewis was not a great heavyweight champion, even though Lewis had beat everybody they put in front of him. And Lewis, I believe to this day, well, I think one of the few fighters who's beaten every person that he's been in the ring with, other than going undefeated. So that fight was highly anticipated. And I talked about how when you have heavyweights, it moves the needle. People will knock on the door. They will spend good money. And I believe that was really the first time that we saw the same pay-per-view prices going up, was because of that fight. So I know the next fight we're going to talk about moved the prices really into the stratosphere. That was that first fight where ticket sales, I believe the tickets for that fight was going to say $2,400 a seat. So that was really the first time that you really saw prices going up. And also keep in mind, that was the first time you had a joint venture with 2 rival networks. Because again, Lennox Lewis was contractually tied to Showtime. Lennox Lewis was contractually tied to HBO. Mike Tyson was contractually tied to Showtime. So now these 2 cable giants had to come to some type of resolution to have a joint pay-per-view where their most well-known fighters are able to get this fight going. And again, that was the first time you had a Showtime announcer and Bobby Chiz, an HBO announcer and Jim Lampley calling the fight. And I thought it was great. Since Lewis won the fight, HBO won the rights to rebroadcast that fight. So when you listen to the rebroadcast of the fight, that's when you heard Larry Merchant, I forget who else, it might have been maybe Roy Jones Jr., who might have been doing a commentary for the rebroadcast of that fight. And again, that fight was highly anticipated. That was the biggest fight at that time that was made in boxing by far. And again, it was either going to stamp Lewis's legacy or give Mike Tyson a chance to reclaim his glory that he pretty much lost in 1990. So it's about 12 years from 1990 to 2002. The American public was still fascinated with the aura of one Mike Tyson. And Lewis, again, was that, basically molded himself from the silver gold medal to working with the Mayweather Stewart to becoming the great champion that he became. And that fight, 1.95 million pay-per-view buys for a gate of $106 million. And that was a lot of money. That fight, the highest grossing fight until eventually the fight was eclipsed by Oscar De La Hoya and Floyd Mayweather 5 years later, again, and that's due to star power. Now again, you want to talk about star power, outside of boxing, I just laid it out for you. Mike Tyson from the 1980s. Mike Tyson Punch-Out for those kids who grew up in the 80s and the 90s. Mike Tyson Punch-Out. Mike Tyson truly was a breakout star, a mainstream star that transcended the sport of boxing. Even as great as Evander Holyfield was not that superstar that Mike Tyson was. And that alone brought a lot of fans into the arena because, again, Mike just had that personality with the knockouts and the mystique and the aura with Mike Tyson. And I think that would have brought in a lot of casual fans. Again, this is the highest grossing, at the time, the highest grossing fight by far. So again, you know, we're talking about Mike was a star outside of the ring. Lewis, not so much. Again, amongst us hardcore fans, we knew about Lennox Lewis, but Mike clearly was a star. I mentioned this before. If you think of mainstream stars outside of boxing, obviously Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Leonard, to maybe an extent the late Marvin Hagler, then Mike Tyson, then Oscar De La Hoya, then Floyd Mayweather, maybe Manny Pacquiao. So again, we're talking about Mike is on a short list of guys who their star power really transcended the sport of boxing. And till this day, Mike Tyson is still a star in the sport of boxing as he did an exhibition versus Roy Jones. So to this day, people still love and appreciate Mike Tyson. So again, that fight is part of our fight card. And in our main event of the evening, Floyd Money Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao, May the 2nd, 2015. Floyd Mayweather, 47-0, 26 knockouts. Manny Pacquiao, 57 wins, 5 losses, and 2 draws with 38 KOs, and that fight occurred at the MGM Grand. Let's just break down some money here. That fight, the gross revenue of the fight was $300 to $400 million. Folks, that fight generated more money than Super Bowl 49 with the New England Patriots against the Seattle Seahawks in the famous Malcolm Butler 1-yard interception to end the game. 4.6 million pay-per-view buys that shattered all types of records. Ladies and gentlemen, why was that fight so significant? Again, that fight happened in 2015. That fight really was supposed to happen in 2009, 2010. But through drug testing and disagreements about money, and I'm not doing it this way, and I'm the A fighter and I'm the B fighter, there was a lot of literally 5 or 6 years of frustration. Even myself, I became frustrated. And it was something that a lot of people were looking towards that fight. Again, I mentioned how Lewis and Tyson was the first fight that drove up ticket prices. That fight just knocked the regular person, us, the average fan, from even attending that fight. I remember hotel prices went up like 1,000%. Rental car price went up 1,000%. So when you have these type of fights, in a way, we as fight fans, we love it, but here's where the negative comes in. It squeezes us out. I mean, of course, we can go, but we got to break the bank. And I believe ringside seats like $250,000. So everybody you saw up there was your athletes and your celebrities and stuff like that. But so it goes to show you how highly anticipated this fight was. There's really no point in going into it. You all remember watching that fight. You all remember having your own fight party watching that fight. So that fight was highly anticipated, and that's our main event. Now, where do we go from here now? What are some of the questions that I'm going to pose on y'all? Before I get to that, let's go to a location. So we got to have a location in order to host this mega event. And we at Chin Check Radio have been to Atlantic City on numerous occasions. We have watched the fight. We have watched fights there. We were there for Samuel Peter versus Vladimir Klitschko. We were there for Bernard Hopkins and Antonio Tarver. So we've actually been there. We were there for a for a Don King promoted fight card in 2003. We have been to Madison Square Garden. We were there for Felix Trinidad versus Ricardo Mayorga when Trinidad made his comeback. And that's a lively atmosphere. We were in Las Vegas for Mayweather and Shane Mosley when Mosley rocked Mayweather in the second round. We have been to Dallas, Texas to watch the Dallas Cowboys, our beloved Dallas Cowboys. And also we have been to the city of Atlanta watching fights. Now, where are we as promoter going to hold this mega event? Now let's go through all these cities. Atlantic City. Maybe back then, yeah, not so much now. Let's go to Madison Square Garden. You can look in New York City, but how much tickets are you really going to get in Madison Square Garden, the world's most famous arena? course, you have the MGM Grand and the T-Mobile Arena. Vegas is always jumping. It's always something to do in Vegas, but you can only squeeze X amount of people in the arena because you want this to be a packed house. Now that leaves you with two arenas. Dallas Cowboy, well, AT&T Stadium down in Arlington, or the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, we know that the AT&T Stadium can hold more people, but would it be more stuff to do in the city of Atlanta? So we're going to hold the fight at the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, pricing. Now, the guy on Twitter, he posed an asking price of, let's say, $500. We're going to be modest here. We're going to leave it, we'll do $300. You have 6 fights lined up, $50 a pop. So you figure every fight that we talked about was their own pay-per-view main event. Are you, as a fight fan, going to shell out $300? And that's minimum. Now, I really could do 5, but we'll have fun with this conversation. Now, for those of us who are going to think too deep into this, the question is, are you going to come out of your pocket and pay $300? Don't tell me, well, I would just stream it, I would go to a friend's house, I would do this. No. You have no other choice. Would you pay $300 to watch this fight card? Simple as that. Or if you and your buddy get together, you want to spend $150, y'all can do that. But on this fight, on this card, based on star power, based on, again, this is us understanding and living through the anticipation of these fights. Would you come out of your pocket, you in your individual capacity, Wes, Felix, McKnight, Ralph, Adam, Julio, BJ, you getting some too, would you come out of your pocket and spend $300 for those 6 fights that I just talked about? So have fun with it. Definitely. I am requiring a response, whether it is on Twitter, whether it's on YouTube. Spread this around to other fight fans. This is our all-time matchup fight card based on fighters that we grew up watching, fights that we grew up watching, and we were around for the anticipation of these fights. Again, play this to friends at work. Spread this mess around. Usually we don't ask y'all to do this, but we're going to do this one time, because this is truly a fun topic. Spread this around to all your people. Are you willing to pay, in your individual capacity, $300 for these fights that we just talked about? So spread it to a friend. Send it overseas. Send it wherever. So ask a friend. Have fun with it. We'll hit back from us, and we are requiring a response. No questions asked. So have fun with it. Until the next time, the Chin Check Radio signing out.